Shalom, my name is Todd Bennett, and I'd like to welcome you to this latest installment of the Leaving Babylon series. Last week we talked about the importance of understanding that if you're in the scriptural covenant, then you need to identify with the called out assembly of Yisrael. Of course, Yisrael was chosen to be a nation of priests, and because of the sin of the golden calf, the priestly function was transferred from the firstborn to the Levites, who represented the firstborn in the house of Elohim. Now, the priests just didn't serve in the temple in Jerusalem, as many often think. They lived among the tribes, and they were supposed to teach the people the ways of righteousness. So not only did the priests serve in the temple in Jerusalem, but they served throughout the nation of Yisrael, teaching the people the Torah and how to live as priests. And of course, the entire nation was supposed to shine as a light to the nations around them as a priestly people. Now, sadly, the priesthood failed, and instead of shining as a light and drawing the nations to Yahuwah, the people of Israel were drawn to the false gods of the nations that surrounded them and actually lived amongst them. We read in Deuteronomy 7:1-6, when Yahuwah your Elohim brings you into the land which you go to possess, and has cast out many nations before you, the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you, and when Yahuwah your Elohim delivers them over to you, you shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them, nor shall you make marriages with them. You shall not give your daughter to their son, nor take their daughter for your son, for they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. So the anger of Yahuwah will be aroused against you and destroy you suddenly. But thus you shall deal with them. You shall destroy their altars and break down their sacred pillars and cut down their wooden images and burn their carved images with fire. For you are a set-apart people to Yahuwah your Elohim. Yahuwah your Elohim has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples on the face of the earth. So we see they were supposed to go into the land, cleanse the land, and set the land apart amongst all the nations on the earth. And of course, they failed to do so. They didn't completely rid those nations from the land, and oftentimes they lived amongst them. And slowly but surely, those people influenced the Israelites with their pagan gods and their pagan forms of worship. And of course, we see that happening today. Essentially, Israel was punished because she failed to obey the commands. She failed to remain set apart. She failed to shine as a light to the nations. And then the kingdom of Israel was ultimately divided, and both kingdoms were exiled. Now, the Messiah came to restore the Melchizedek priesthood within Israel and be that light that Israel failed to be. And we read about that in Isaiah 42:6-7. I, Yahuwah, have called you in righteousness and will hold your hand. I will keep you and give you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the Gentiles, to open blind eyes, to bring out prisoners from the prison, those who sit in darkness from the prison house. And we also read in Isaiah 49:6, indeed, he says, it is too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Yisrael. I will also give you as a light to the Gentiles, that you should be my salvation to the ends of the earth. And of course, we recognize these as messianic prophecies, and of course that's why Yeshua started by training his disciples in what is known as the Galilee of the Gentiles. We read that in Isaiah 9:1. The word Gentiles is goyim, and it means the nations, and it really means the heathens, those that did not follow Elohim, those that were not in covenant with Elohim. Those are the nations. So you had essentially the world broken down into 2 groups. You had Yisrael and you had the nations. Israel was in covenant, The nations were not. They followed the false gods. So the Galilee of the nations is significant. It's the Galilee of the Goyim, the Galilee of the heathens. And of course, the reason it was called that is because that used to be the land of the house of Yisrael. And the house of Israel was taken out. They were removed by the Assyrian Empire, and they were replaced by people from all over the nation. So they were strangers in the Galilee, and that was for a specific purpose. And that's why Yeshua went to the Galilee of the nations, because he said specifically, I came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He came for those who had been removed from that portion of the covenant land. And of course, we're waiting to see the ultimate restoration of the house of Israel, the regathering of the house of Israel, and the regathering of the house of Yehuda. And we're going to talk about that more in the future teaching. But basically, Matthew 5:14, Yeshua said, you are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. So he was talking about the people that followed him in his teachings. And he said in John 8:12, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. And he also said in John 9:5, as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So Yeshua came, as prophesied by Isaiah, to shine as that light that Israel was supposed to shine as, but they'd failed in that duty. So he came as the Melchizedek, the firstborn son of Elohim, the high priest of the order of Melchizedek, to shine as that light, and then to draw the firstborn priesthood unto him, that they may also shine as a light. So we are supposed to be priests, and we're supposed to shine as a light of the world, a light to the world. And as we spoke about last time, in order to become part of this priesthood, your genetic history is not as important as whether you've been transformed by the blood of Messiah into a new creation, because that blood carries the genetic chromosome structure that we need to have within us as a new creation. So that's when genes become important, when we talk about being washed by the blood of the Lamb and by becoming new creations through the blood of Messiah. That's when genetic history is very important, not tracing our lineage to whether we can find that our mother was Jewish or our grandmother was Jewish, or if we have a piece of paper that says we're Jewish. It's in our heart, it's inside of us, it's our blood. It's not necessarily something from our heritage, something from our past. We have to be transformed into new creations in order to be part of this priesthood, and only through Yeshua and his blood can we do that. So Yeshua is the son of Elohim. He holds the firstborn status, and all authority on heaven and earth has been given to him, and he holds the keys to death and Sheol. And if we're covered by his blood, then we expect to be resurrected into his eternal priesthood. And again, that's when genetics become important. Until then, we're rehearsing and serving with the promise that we too carry the firstborn status in the kingdom and can serve as priests in the order of Melchizedek. So your genetic makeup is not the distinguishing factor. The question is whether the Torah has been written on your heart and placed in your mind through the renewed covenant, prophesied by Yirmiyahu 31 at 31:33, and fulfilled by Yeshua at what is commonly referred to as the Last Supper. It was his last Passover before he was crucified, and that's when he renewed the covenant. It wasn't a brand new covenant, it was a covenant renewed with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, as prophesied by Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, and I'll read that starting at 31. Behold, the days are coming, says Yahuwah, when I will make a renewed covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Yehuda, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, though I was a husband to them, says Yahuwah. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says Yahuwah. I will put my Torah in their minds and write it on their hearts. And I will be their Elohim, and they shall be my people. No more shall every man teach his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know Yahuwah, for they all shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, says Yahuwah, for I will forgive their iniquity and their sin I will remember no more. So You know, this is a good thing to ask your Christian, friends and family is, all right, Yeshua came to establish the new covenant. What is that new covenant, and where do I find the terms of that covenant? And of course, it's in the passage that we just read from Yirmiyahu, and it's all about the Torah. It's all about putting the Torah in our minds and on our hearts. And this is the covenant that provides us with the much needed forgiveness of sins. And notice that it involves knowledge, and knowledge is yada. And it often implies an intimate, face-to-face relationship with someone. And oftentimes the word yada, Adam knew his wife, Hava. He knew her. He had intimate relations with her. So that's the level of relationship we're supposed to have with our Creator, an intimate relationship where we know Him. And that's ultimately what we will receive through the fulfillment of this renewed covenant. Jeremiah 31:34 contains a powerful reference to the Messiah that can only be seen in the Hebrew text. It's called the Aleph Ta. Aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and Ta is the last. And we often see this Aleph Ta, which contains the entire Hebrew language, as a reference to the Messiah. In fact, we see it 2 times in the first chapter and verse of Genesis. And it's a real mystery that John spoke of when we read in John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with Elohim, and the Word was Elohim. He was in the beginning with Elohim, and all things were made through Him, and without Him nothing was made that was made. So I just throw that out there because in this prophecy provided by Yirmiyahu about this renewed covenant, we see an incredible reference to the Messiah, the Word, but it can only be seen in the Hebrew text, and that's why in a future teaching we're going to talk about the importance of knowing the Hebrew language, reading the scriptural text in the Hebrew so that we can see these important messages that are in there. And the reason that the Torah is put in our minds and written on our hearts is so that we won't forget the commandments, so that we won't forget the instructions, and that so we can obey. And that's, of course, the ultimate point of it all. And that's why when you ask a Christian, where is this renewed covenant that the Messiah brought about, it's very important that you show them in Jeremiah, because many believe that Yeshua came to do away with the commandments. And he specifically said, I didn't come to abolish the Torah or the prophets, I came to fulfill. And the fulfillment of that was through the renewed covenant of getting that Torah on our minds and in our hearts so that it's with us, it permeates us. He walked out the Torah. He was the Torah in the flesh, and that's how we're supposed to walk. Everything he did emanated Torah observance because he was that word in the flesh, and it's supposed to get inside of us to the point where we live the Torah, we breathe it, we speak it. Everything we do emanates the instructions of Elohim. So sadly, Christianity believes that the Torah is done away with, it's old, it's irrelevant, and nothing could be further from the truth. The Torah needs to get inside of us so that it permeates everything that we do. And of course, as priests, that's the whole point. We get it in our minds, we learn it, and then it's in our hearts so that we then desire to walk it out. And in Jeremiah 7:23 we read, but this is what I command them, saying, obey my voice, and I will be your Elohim, and you shall be my people, and walk in all the ways that I've commanded you, that it may be well with you. And that's the point of it all. We also saw how Hosea nailed the problem, specifically in Hosea 4:6. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And of course, we talked about that knowledge being the knowledge, which was the instructions, the commandments, the Torah. Because you've rejected knowledge, I also will reject you from being priests for me. Because you've forgotten the Torah of your Elohim, I also will forget your children. So we need the Torah in our minds so that we know what to do, and we need the Torah in our hearts so that we yearn to actually do the commandments. And as priests, we need both. And the distinguishing part of a priest is his service to Elohim, not just that he knows the commandments, but that he does them. And Yeshua vividly demonstrated that by the fact that not only was he the son of Elohim. Not only was the high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, but he also was the suffering servant who laid down his life for his people. And of course, this is a snare that many people fall into when they get into the Hebrew roots movement or Messianic Judaism, and they realize that Christianity has not always taught them the truth, that they've inherited a lot of traditions, a lot of lies that are contrary to the scriptures. They yearn for knowledge, and they spend so much time getting the knowledge in our minds that they forget about their hearts. And of course, this can be a real test. Some people end up falling away from the Messiah and chasing after rabbinic Judaism because all they want to do is learn more knowledge and find new traditions. And the enemy, I can assure you, has laid out snares all over the place, and there's landmines all along the straight path of the Torah. So if you step to the right or to the left, it can be very destructive. And it's critical that you stay focused on Yeshua, our high priest, as we learn and serve in the renewed covenant. And that's why the Torah provides us with the reminders to do the commandments, because we can't just get it in our minds. It's got to be in our hearts also, and it's got to flow through us, and we have to live the Torah. And of course, we've already talked a bit about setting apart the Sabbath, wearing of tzitzit to remind us of the commandments, and we even spoke about the dietary instructions. Since most of us eat 3 meals a day, this is something that we need to address regularly. So these are some important ways that we can start walking out the truth of the Torah. And while most people eat most of their meals in their homes, today we live in most people used to live or eat most of their meals in their homes. We live in a very mobile society, and that's not necessarily the case any longer. But there's a very practical commandment concerning setting apart our homes that we read about in one of the most important commandments known as the Shema. In fact, Yeshua actually referred to this commandment as the greatest commandment in Mark 12:29. And we read about it in Deuteronomy 6:4. It says, "Hear, O Yisrael, Yahuwah our Elohim, Yahuwah is one. You shall love Yahuwah your Elohim with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And these words, which I command you today, shall be in your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk along the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." And that last sentence is what we're concerned about for this part of our discussion. But notice that the words, the Torah, is supposed to be in us. We're supposed to be thinking about it when we rise up, when we lie down, when we walk. Everything that we do, we're supposed to be considering the Torah and the instructions and walking in that. And of course, it reminds us, you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And again, in Deuteronomy 11:18 through 21, we read, "Therefore you shall lay up these words of mine in your heart and in your soul, and bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall teach them to your children, speaking of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, that your days and the days of your children may be multiplied in the land of which Yahweh swore to your fathers to give them, like the days of the heavens above the earth." So the doorposts are the mezuzot, okay? And these are the same mezuzot or doorposts where the blood of the Passover lamb was to be placed, as we read about in Exodus 12:7. Now, placing this word on the doorpost, there's no specific way to observe this. Of course, again, Rabbinic Judaism has all sorts of rules and regulations concerning where you place it, what angle you place it. But there's no commandment in the Torah specifically. We're just supposed to write it on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And I have some examples here. This is a beautiful mezuzah that I actually bought in at a settlement called Esh Kodesh, Holy Fire, near Shiloh, and the person made it out of glass. And what people often do is maybe take a scroll of the scriptures and tuck it in here, and then place it on the doorpost so that they see it and they remember the commandments. This is a more traditional one, which actually has a sheen, shaddai, and the scroll can be placed down in here. and you can put it then on your doorpost. This is another example, which we actually have on our website. I like this one because the word isn't hidden. It's not in a scroll tucked away, but it's actually engraved on this bronze mezuzah that you then put on the doorpost, so people can actually read the commandments. And others actually inscribe the commandments right on the doorpost. If you have a wooden doorpost, they actually inscribe the words on their doorpost. So there's all sorts of ways you can do it. And how you do it is not as important as why you do it. And because like the tzitzit, the mezuzah reminds us of the commandments. And the tzitzit are on our bodies, and they remind us when we're in and out of our homes that everything we do is supposed to be centered around the instructions of Elohim. And the mezuzah, placing it on our homes, it announces to the world that in this house, the rules of the kingdom apply, that this is a Torah observant household, and that we follow the Torah. And it's a reminder every time you walk in and out that you need to be considering your actions and whether you're following the Torah. And this actually takes us back to the Sabbath commandment. In Exodus 28 through 11, we read, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it set apart. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of Yahuwah, your Elohim. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days Yahweh made the heavens and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." And so again, we see the Sabbath is all about being set apart. And remember, we talked about that it's supposed to be in our moshav, our dwelling places. And so we're supposed to place the mezuzah on our homes and on our gates. So that really encompasses our moshav. And so we see in this commandment concerning the Sabbath that anybody that we have control over, our animals and our children and our servants, everybody who's within our gates, within our moshav, we're supposed to allow to rest on that day also. So the mezuzah helps us to kind of create that territorial perimeter where the commandments are supposed to apply. So far we've recommended some basic commandments to keep us focused and headed in the right direction as we come out of Babylon. And this is because most of us have come out of Christianity and have been taught that the commandments are not applicable to us. So it's quite a process to actually reverse that walk, to turn towards the commandments and start obeying them. And of course, this is also something that the early assembly had to deal with. It's not new, and I'm not really giving you any new advice that wasn't dealt with in the early assembly of believers that we read about actually in Acts 15. There was a decision that had to be made by James as to how they were going to instruct new believers. And the issue specifically was talked about in Acts 15:5, but some of the sect of the Pharisees who believed rose up saying it is necessary to circumcise them and to command them to keep the Torah of Moses. Now, the Pharisees, a little background, we've already talked about, had developed an extensive tradition concerning circumcision. We know the Pharisees had added to and taken away from the commandments. So these Pharisees, they believed in Yeshua, but they also were carrying a lot of their traditions with them, and they wanted to actually have everybody go through this conversion process, this Pharisaic conversion process, so that they could observe the Torah. And of course, this was and remains a very controversial issue, especially today. The whole issue of circumcision is really a hot button issue where people like to say, oh, it's legalism if you become circumcised. But let's look at Acts 15 to just see what they were dealing with. It says, basically, they were saying you don't need to be circumcised in order to be saved, because these are two different issues that we're dealing with. And the concept of being saved is something that was very different back then than what it is now. Christians have this idea that they go to an altar call or they raise their hand and they say a prayer and boom, they're instantly saved. It's like they get a ticket to heaven right at that point because of what they said or what they believed in their heart or a prayer that they spoke. That's not the scriptural concept of salvation. And we're going to spend some time dealing with the whole issue of salvation in another teaching also. The early believers, though, just to touch on it real quickly, salvation was a process. It was our walk, and it was something that was expected in the end. When you've walked out your walk, and you're either you've passed and you're in Sheol, the promise was that you would be saved from death. That death would not keep you. You wouldn't stay in Sheol. That you would be resurrected, and that was when salvation actually occurred. You were saved from death. You were brought into life. Okay, and I talk about that in my book, Salvation: The Covenant Journey. But for now, the early believers were just dealing with people who were coming out of paganism and into the faith. And the Torah of Moses was really quite foreign to them. They hadn't lived according to these instructions like the other Israelites had. They'd grown up on it. They'd gone to the synagogue, and they knew the instructions. It was embedded in the community. Although Yeshua came to really reveal that what the Pharisees and the Sadducees were teaching were, in addition, they were putting people into bondage, and Yeshua was actually getting people back to the purity of the Torah and the simplicity of the Torah. Nevertheless, the pagans really had no idea of righteousness described in the Torah. So it was quite a process for them to come out of paganism and come right into the assembly of Yisrael. And it's interesting that Yeshua didn't force people through a conversion process before he would teach to them or minister to them. And so we see James in Acts 15 as really the head of the assembly, moving slowly, and his decision was based in wisdom. The point was not to burden people with knowing the entire Torah and being circumcised immediately before they could enter into the assembly. Circumcision is a choice that should be made when somebody's fully aware of the covenant. And you're not fully aware of the covenant until you understand the entire Torah. So in Acts 15, 18 through 21, we read the decision that James came up to with a solution to this problem of all these pagans coming into the faith. He says, "Known to Elohim from eternity are all his works. Therefore I judge that we should not trouble those from among the Gentiles, the nations, who are turning to Elohim, but that we write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from things strangled, and from blood. For Moses has had throughout many generations those who preach him in every city, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath." So there you have it. These were not, first of all, they're not Gentiles converting to any religion, okay? They were turning to Elohim. And the way you turn to Elohim is through repentance. Repentance involves turning away from our wicked ways and turning to the Elohim of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, the Elohim of Yisrael. And we turn to him through our actions and our obedience. So it's our heart. Yes, we make a decision, but then our decision results in obedience, that we act according to the ways of the Elohim. And that's what demonstrates that we actually have repented, is how we conduct ourselves. And that's the Christian conundrum that I write about in my book called The Christian Conundrum, is this whole notion that we make a decision in our hearts, but then we say, well, we don't have to obey the commandments anymore. Well, so your actions don't reflect the supposed decision you made in your heart. True repentance involves not just a decision you make in your mind or something that you feel in your heart or a prayer that you say. True repentance results in actions, and actions are obedience to the instructions of the Torah. So what James was doing was giving them some of the basics, get them cleaned up so they can learn to be set apart, so that then they can attend the assembly in the synagogue every Shabbat. He didn't want them to be polluted from the idolatry, the sexual immorality, and he changed their diet. So very similar to what we've talked about in this road out of Babylon. The overriding theme of the advice that he gave them was that they start going to the synagogue where Moses is read, and then they can learn the Torah every Sabbath. And as we hear and learn week after week, then we can begin to walk out the faith. Circumcision could come when they were fully prepared to enter into the covenant. And after all, the primary commandment concerning circumcision was to circumcise all males on the 8th day. These were pagans that had not been circumcised on the 8th day. So there was not a real hurry now to circumcise them. they needed to understand the instructions and a covenant before then they can make that decision to bear the sign of that covenant, which is circumcision. And of course, they would need to be circumcised before they participated in the Passover if they were going to join the assembly. We read that commandment in Exodus 12:48. And when a stranger dwells with you and wants to keep the Passover to Yahuwah, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and keep it. And he shall be as a native of the land, for no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. So that's just clear. So clearly they're supposed to obey the commandments, although obedience is a process, and James was not going to subscribe to some burdensome Pharisaic conversion process. He provided a formula for them to start getting set apart so they could be in the assembly and hear the Torah. And that process leads to salvation, but it's not salvation, again, as many Westerners understand it. And we'll discuss that in the next episode. For now, I hope that you've enjoyed this discussion that we're having. I hope that you've learned some things. And stay tuned for our next episodes. And until then, my name is Todd Bennett from www.shemayisrael.net. Shalom.